In the autumn of 1923, on the gray shores of Lake Nipissing in northern Ontario, a 43-year-old trapper named Edmund Voss did something the whole town of Corbett's Landing called foolish. He spent the last of his savings, $80, every cent he had left after burying his wife, on a condemned mill property that sat half sunk into the lakeshore mud. Its roof caved in on one side, its dock rotted through to bare pilings. The county auctioneer had laughed when Edmund raised his paddle. The men behind him had laughed louder. But what none of them knew was that a young woman named Clara Ashfield would arrive at that broken mill 3 weeks later, soaking wet and bleeding at the wrist, with nowhere left to go. And they didn't know that Edmund Voss, a man who had not spoken more than a dozen words at a time since his wife passed, would be the only person in Corbett's Landing who did not ask her what she had done to deserve it. This is their story, a tale of what gets left behind and what refuses to stay buried. Edmund signed the papers in the county office while rain tapped against the glass in long, uneven streaks. The clerk, a man named Harold Fitch, read the address twice before looking up. "That's the old Pemberton mill," Harold said. He kept his voice low, as if the building itself might be embarrassed to be mentioned. "You understand the dock is gone." "I saw it," Edmund replied. "Roofs open to the sky on the north end." "I know. Harold looked at him the way people in Corbett's Landing had been looking at Edmund for 2 years, with the careful sideways sympathy reserved for a man they had decided was still not quite right. He dipped his pen and signed his portion without another word. Outside, the rain had not let up. Edmund folded the deed into his coat pocket and pressed his palm flat over it. Across the street, 2 men stood under the eaves of the hardware store, watching him cross to his truck. "Voss just bought the Pemberton place," one of them said. The other shook his head slowly. "Man's been grieving so long he's gone simple." Edmund climbed into the truck and drove north without looking back. The road dissolved into mud past the last house, and the lake appeared in gray pieces between the birches. He parked where the road ended and walked the rest of the way with his hands in his pockets. The mill sat where it had always sat, tilting slightly toward the water, its cedar boards gone silver with age. A crow lifted from the broken roofline and disappeared into the mist. He stood at the doorway for a long moment, looking at the dark interior, at the rusted wheel shaft still lodged in the stone wall, at the light falling through the gap in the roof in a pale, slanted column. He had not told anyone why he bought it. He was not sure he could have explained it in words they would have accepted. His wife, Louise, had always said he was a man who understood things with his hands and not his mouth, and she had meant it kindly. He began with the roof. The work was slow and deliberate, the way Edmund did everything. He split shingles in the morning and laid them in the afternoon, crawling along the ridge in the cold with his jaw set. The floor came next. New boards, cut from timber he hauled himself, fitted and set without gaps. He worked until the light failed, and then sat outside on a stump with tea he made on a camp stove, listening to the lake. The water had a sound at night that he had always found honest. It did not promise anything, it only moved. By the 3rd week, he had a floor, a sound roof, a stove connected to the old chimney, and a door that shut properly. He had not spoken to anyone in 12 days. He had not noticed until he tried to remember when he last had. The morning Clara Ashfield appeared. The temperature had dropped overnight and left a skin of ice on the puddles along the shore path. Edmund was splitting wood behind the mill when he heard the footsteps uneven. Too slow, wrong. He came around the corner and stopped. She was standing at the mill door, one hand pressed against the frame to hold herself up. Her coat was soaked through, her dark hair plastered flat to her face. She was holding her left wrist against her ribs, and the sleeve of her coat was darker than the rest of it. She looked up at him. Her eyes were brown and very steady, which surprised him. Most people, when they were afraid and cold and hurt, let their eyes go wide and unmoored. Hers were focused. She was taking him in, measuring whether to run. "I'm not going to ask you anything," Edmund said. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. He opened the door. Inside, he built up the stove without speaking. She sat where he indicated, on the wooden chair, nearest the heat, and held her wrist in her lap. He brought water and clean cloth from his kit. He was a trapper. He had always kept a clean kit, and knelt and worked without ceremony. The wound was not deep, a branch maybe, or broken glass, but it had bled long enough to matter. He wrapped it firm and even, the way he wrapped everything. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady too, but thinner than her eyes. She had been using all of it to hold herself together. He put a tin pot on the stove and didn't answer. Her name came out in pieces over the next hour. Clara Ashfield. She was 29 years old. She had come to Corbett's Landing 8 months ago to marry a man named Douglas Holt. The Holt family ran the feed supply and half the rental properties on the east side of town. The wedding had happened. The marriage had lasted until Douglas Holt decided that a wife, who spoke her mind in front of his business associates, was a liability he didn't need. He had started with words. Then he had moved on. She had left in the night with a coat and the money she kept in her shoe. Edmund listened to all of it without moving. When she finished, he poured the tea and set it in front of her, and sat down across the table. "You can stay here," he said. She looked at the walls, the new boards, the stove, the light coming through the window he'd reframed 2 days ago. "This is yours, as of 3 weeks ago." She looked at him. "The town thinks I'm simple for buying it," he said, without particular feeling. The corner of her mouth moved. "Then, we'll get along fine." He gave her the wool blanket from his pack. He slept in his truck that first night, which she argued against and he ignored. He was not being gallant. He simply could not think of another arrangement that made sense, so he didn't overthink it. In the morning, she was still there. It was Clara who noticed, on the 4th day, that someone in town already knew where she was. She had walked to the edge of the road to hang the cloth she'd washed in the lake, and a truck had slowed, passing. She didn't know the driver, but he had looked too long and too carefully, and she had felt the specific chill of being recognized by someone who had reason to report back. She told Edmund when he came in for noon. He was quiet for a moment, then nodded once. "Then we deal with it when it comes," he said. It came the following Tuesday. Douglas Holt arrived in a dark green truck with his brother Leonard. Leonard, who was broader and louder, and had the habit of standing slightly in front of Douglas, as if to establish which one mattered more. They parked at the road and walked down the shore path with the confidence of men who had always found doors open for them. Edmund came out of the mill to meet them. He did not hurry. He wiped his hands on a cloth and stood in the doorway with his arms loose at his sides. "Voss," Douglas said. He had a civil voice, the kind used in business meetings and at church. "I understand my wife has been on your property." "She's been here," Edmund said. "I'd like to speak with her. She doesn't want to speak with you." Douglas smiled with the lower half of his face only. "I don't think that's your decision." "She made it hers," Edmund replied. Leonard stepped forward. He had the broad, flat quality of a man who had solved most of his problems by taking up more space than the other person. "You're interfering in a family matter, Voss. You don't want that." Edmund looked at him the way he looked at weather, acknowledging it without being moved by it. "She's an adult woman," Edmund said, "not a piece of property you misplaced." There was a pause. The lake moved behind them, gray and indifferent. "She has obligations," Douglas said. "Legal ones." "Then bring a lawyer," Edmund replied. "Don't bring your brother." Leonard's neck reddened. Douglas put a hand on his arm and smiled again. Thinner this time. "You're making an enemy," Douglas said. Edmund did not answer. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, until the silence became something Douglas had no tool for, and the two men turned and walked back up the path. That night, Edmund sat outside on the old dock piling with a cup of tea and listened to the water. After a while, Clara came and sat on the piling beside him. Not close, just beside. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. He'll come back with something worse." "Yes," Edmund agreed. She was quiet for a moment. The lake made its honest sound. "Why did you buy this place?" she asked. "Really?" He thought about it the way he thought about most things, slowly, testing each part before committing to it. "Louise, my wife. She used to say there were places that had been abandoned before they were finished." He looked at the mill behind them, at the new shingles, the reframed window. "I think I was looking for something I could still do something about." Clara was quiet for a long time after that. "I know that feeling," she said. He did not press her, and she did not explain further, and neither of them felt the gap. Douglas Holt moved faster than Edmund expected. The next afternoon, a man named Constable George Petrie arrived in a county vehicle, his hat level, his manner pained. He had known Edmund Voss for a dozen years, and was clearly not comfortable with the errand he'd been sent on. "Ed," he said, "I've had a complaint filed, harboring a married woman against the wishes of her husband. It's not a criminal matter, but I've been asked to verify the situation." "You can verify it," Edmund said. "Come in." Inside, Clara sat at the table. She did not stand when the constable came in. She looked at him the way she had looked at Edmund that first morning. Steady, measuring, decided. "Mrs. Holt," Petrie said carefully. "Miss Ashfield," she said. "I was Clara Ashfield before I was anything else, and I intend to be her again." Petrie looked at his hat. "Your husband has filed." "My husband broke 4 of my ribs last February," Clara said. She said it the way she might say the weather had been cold. "The doctor in Sudbury wrote it down. I kept the paper." Petrie was quiet. Edmund said nothing. He stood near the stove with his arms at his sides. "If Douglas Holt wants to make this a legal matter," Clara continued, "I would welcome that. I would very much like it to be a legal matter." Petrie replaced his hat on his head. He looked at Edmund. "I'll need to write up a report." "Write it accurately," Edmund said. Petrie nodded and left. That evening, Edmund drove into town and was back within the hour. He set a paper bag on the table without comment. Inside it were 2 meat pies from the bakery and, under, those folded clean and flat, a copy of the Ontario Married Women's Property Act of 1884 that he had found at the library and asked the librarian to copy for him without explanation. Clara looked at the papers for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "Can I ask what you're thinking?" she said. "That you should know what the law actually says," Edmund replied, "before someone else tells you what it says." She read it that night by the stove lamp while Edmund repaired a section of floor in the far corner. The mill was quiet except for the sound of his work and the occasional turning of a page. At some point she said, without looking up, "There's a lawyer in North Bay." "I know," Edmund said. "Ruth Carver. She handled Louise's estate." A pause. "Is she good?" "She told the bank they were wrong," Edmund said. "She was right. They apologized." Clara turned another page. What Corbett's Landing noticed, it noticed slowly, and then all at once. It began with small things. People who passed the mill road started to slow down for reasons that had nothing to do with the mud. The woman at the post office asked Edmund how the repairs were coming in a tone that contained a secondary question she didn't quite ask. At the hardware store, the owner, a man named Fletcher, slid a box of extra nails across the counter without pricing them. "Overstock," Fletcher said, and looked elsewhere. Douglas Holt noticed the shift before Edmund did, which was what made him dangerous. When a man who has relied on community deference feels that deference beginning to turn, he rarely responds by reconsidering. He responds by pushing harder on whatever gave him ground before. The Saturday it broke open, the church social was the occasion. Edmund had not attended, but Clara had gone at the urging of a woman named Marjorie Teal, who ran the lending library from her front room and had taken to dropping by the mill with books she said were surplus. Clara was sitting in a folding chair near the side wall when Douglas crossed the room toward her. He did not touch her. He was too careful for that, and too aware of who was watching. He simply stood close enough that she would feel it, and said, in his civil voice, "You're embarrassing yourself, Clara, and the people sheltering you." Clara looked at him. "I was embarrassed," she said quietly, "when I stayed." She stood up and walked to where Marjorie was pouring tea and sat down beside her and did not look back. Douglas turned to go and found his way gently blocked by a woman named Dr. Agnes Fry, who ran the town's only medical practice from a converted house on the main road, and who had not, to anyone's recollection, ever raised her voice in public. "Douglas," she said, in a voice like a closed door, "I examined your wife in February. I made notes." The room was not quiet, but the part of the room near Douglas Holt had gone very still. He left shortly after. On the drive back to the mill, Clara sat in Edmund's truck with her hands folded in her lap and watched the birches go past in the headlights. After a while, she said, "She never told me she'd written anything down." "Some people do the right thing without announcing it," Edmund said. Clara looked at him. "You're one of those," she said. He didn't answer, which was, she had learned, his version of agreement. Ruth Carver drove up from North Bay. On a Wednesday, practical shoes, a case of papers, and the kind of directness that came from 20 years of being the only woman in rooms that expected her to be quiet. She sat at the mill table across from Clara for 2 hours, asking questions with the precision of someone cutting to what mattered and discarding the rest. Edmund stayed outside and split wood. When Ruth came to the door at the end of it, she looked at him with something close to approval. "She's got a case," Ruth said. "A clear one. If the doctor's notes hold up." "They'll hold up," Edmund said. Ruth glanced back at the mill, then at Edmund. "You know this town will take a while to fully come around." "Towns usually do," Edmund said. "Doesn't change what's right while they're thinking about it." Ruth nodded. She got in her car and drove south. The weeks that followed moved with a tension that had its own weather. Clara received the legal notices and read each one carefully, then filed them in a wood box. She kept on the shelf Edmund had built beside the stove. Edmund continued working on the mill, replacing the dock pilings, laying new stone around the foundation where the ground had heaved. He worked as he always worked, steadily, without fanfare, like a man who intended to be in a place for a long time. One afternoon, he came inside for water and found Clara at the table with the papers spread around her, her expression closed and still in the way it got when she was holding something in. He poured water for both of them and sat down. "Ruth says Douglas will probably settle," Clara said without looking up. "He doesn't want a trial. Too much comes out in a trial," Edmund nodded. "She says I could have a separation by spring." Clara traced a corner of one of the documents with her finger. "I'd need to be somewhere stable, a known address, regular employment or means." Edmund drank his water. "The mill needs a bookkeeper," he said. "Someone to manage records when I start selling timber again." She looked at him. "I'd pay fair wages," he said. "The county registry would see a proper address and employment, would satisfy what Ruth needs." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Edmund." He waited. "Are you doing this for legal reasons?" He considered that with the seriousness he gave everything. "No," he said. She looked out the window at the lake, which was beginning, at the edges near the shore, to go gray and thick with the first film of freeze. After a while, she said, "I haven't trusted a man's word in a long time." "I know," Edmund said. "You don't have to. Watch the actions." She turned back to the papers and began sorting them, but her shoulders had changed. Something in them released, small and real. Outside, the lake moved. The dock Edmund had rebuilt held steady in the current. The hearing was in November, in the county courthouse at Corbett's Landing, a room that smelled of pipe smoke, old wood, and the particular staleness of a space where difficult things had been decided too slowly for too long. People came, more than Edmund had expected. Marjorie Teal sat in the third row with her hands folded. Dr. Agnes Fry sat near the aisle. Fletcher from the hardware store arrived late and stood at the back. Douglas Holt sat at the front with his lawyer, a man who had the look of someone paid to project confidence rather than provide it. Clara sat beside Ruth Carver. She wore a gray coat Edmund had not seen before. Something borrowed, he suspected, from Marjorie. Her back was straight, and she did not look at Douglas once. Edmund sat 3 rows back and kept his hands on his knees. Ruth laid the case out plainly. The doctor's notes. The photographs Agnes Fry had taken in February and kept in an envelope in her filing cabinet for 9 months, saying nothing, doing nothing, because she had not had a way to act on them alone, and now she did. The records of Clara's attempts to access shared bank accounts, denied. The letter Douglas had written to Clara's mother in Manitoba, telling her that Clara had gone unwell and should not be contacted. That last one moved through the courtroom differently than the others. The quality of the silence changed. Douglas's lawyer argued what he could, that the household had been difficult, that Clara had been volatile, that a husband had certain authority that the law historically recognized. Ruth listened with her pen down. The law has been changing, Ruth said, when she was given room to reply. It changed in 1884, and it keeps changing, because the understanding of what a person is entitled to keeps expanding. Miss Ashfield is entitled to safety. She is entitled to work. She is entitled to a front door she can open from the inside. The judge, a man named Hargreaves who had the worn look of someone who had heard every version of every story, looked at the photographs for a long time. Then he looked at Douglas Holt. Then he looked at his papers. The order came before the hour was out. Legal separation, effective immediately. Clara Ashfield was to retain use of her wages and any property in her own name. Douglas Holt was to have no contact. Douglas stood. For a moment he looked like a man about to say something that would make everything worse for him. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. He left without speaking. Edmund did not move immediately. He sat where he was until most of the room had cleared, and then he stood and settled his hat on his head. Outside, Clara was standing on the courthouse steps with Ruth, and Marjorie had come up beside her. And Agnes Fry was there too, and they were talking the way women talk when something has been completed, and they are permitting themselves to acknowledge it. Edmund stood at the bottom of the steps and waited. Clara looked down at him. Her face, in the pale November light, was tired and clear at once. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. She came down the steps, and they walked back to the truck together, not touching, the town around them adjusting to the new shape of things. Some people nodded. A few looked away. Fletcher, passing on the street, said Edmund's name once, then kept walking. It was not welcome, exactly. It was the town beginning to remember that it had a version of itself it preferred to be. Winter settled over Lake Nipissing, with the seriousness it always brought to that country. Ice thickening from the shore outward, birches gone bare, the sky sitting low and white over everything. Edmund worked inside through the worst of it, reinforcing the floor joists, running proper pipe from the stove, building shelves along the south wall that Clara filled with the books. Marjorie kept pressing on her, and with the ledger books she had started keeping for the mill operation. She had a hand for numbers. Edmund had known this, after watching her go through the timber pricing once, catching 2 errors in the county assessment that he had missed both times. She had a hand for most things. He was learning. She fixed the latch on the door the morning she noticed it, sticking without being asked. She learned the difference between the sounds the ice made, when it was safe and when it was not, and she did not go out on it until she was sure. She cooked with the focused efficiency of someone who had once had very little and knew how to make it count. They worked beside each other and talked when there was something to say. The silences between them had stopped being careful and started being easy, which Edmund recognized as the more significant change. In January, a letter came from Clara's mother in Manitoba. Edmund saw her face when she read it. The particular stillness of someone absorbing something they had thought was gone for good. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and did not mention it, and Edmund did not ask. And that evening she got it out again and read it a second time at the lamp. And he noticed her shoulders were different after. "She wants to visit," Clara said eventually. "I can build out the back room before May," Edmund said. She looked up at him. "I'd already thought about it," he said, which was true. He had been thinking about what the mill would look like in 3 years, in 5. He had not let himself think that way in 2 years, and the fact that he could again was something he noticed without ceremony, the way he noticed most true things. Spring came late and decisively, the way it always did in northern Ontario. Nothing, 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 and then all at once the ice groaning and the geese, and the smell of mud and cold water mixing into something that was entirely itself. Edmund repaired the dock properly, with good timber, fitted to take weight and weather. Clara painted the mill door a dark red, the tin of paint produced from the back of Marjorie Teal's lending library, as if it had been waiting. A family from 2 properties north came by in April, the Holloways, whose daughter was sick with what their usual man could not place. Clara had no medical training, but she had spent 9 months reading everything Marjorie had, which included 2 veterinary manuals and a nursing reference from 1911, and she had a quality Edmund had observed in only a few people. She listened to what was actually being said, instead of what she expected to hear. She sent them to Agnes Fry with a specific description that Agnes later told Edmund had been exactly right. After that, people came to the mill for other reasons. Not many, and not all at once, but the kind of steady occasional traffic that suggested a place had become known for something useful. Edmund had never sought that out. It arrived because of Clara, and he let it, because it was hers to cultivate. One evening in June, they sat on the rebuilt dock as the light went low over the lake, the water going from gray to copper to something without a name. A heron stood in the shallows 20 feet out, absolutely still, waiting with the patience that only came from knowing exactly what you were. "Do you miss it?" Clara asked. Before all this, Edmund thought about it properly. "I miss Louise," he said. "I don't miss the quiet that came after. That was a different thing." She nodded. "Do you miss Manitoba?" he asked. "I miss who I was there," she said. "Before I thought I needed to be smaller to be loved." She paused. "I don't miss being smaller." He looked at her. In the copper light, she looked like someone who had decided something and was not going back. "You were never smaller," he said. "You were just in the wrong room." She was quiet for a moment. The heron struck, lifted, rose with slow wings over the water. "Edmund," she said. He waited. "I'd like to stay, not because I have to, because I want to." He looked at the lake, at the dock that had been rotten and was now sound, at the mill behind them that had been opened to the sky and now held heat and light, and all the things 2 people accumulated when they stopped waiting for the other one to leave. "I'd like that," he said. The heron disappeared into the tree line. The lake settled. The day closed behind it like a door that had finally been built to fit right. What is chosen when everything else has fallen away? That is the thing that lasts.